This is the unknown zone, where the myths of history meet the shadows of war, and where the stories buried beneath centuries re-emerge to reveal the truth behind power. Few artifacts in human history carry a legend as enduring, as feared, or as misunderstood as the Spear of Destiny. A single relic, revered by emperors, coveted by conquerors, and surrounded by 1,000 years of prophecy. And in the early 20th century, one man became convinced that this ancient spear could change the fate of the world: Adolf Hitler. To understand why Hitler believed the Spear of Destiny held supernatural power, we must first travel back through centuries of myth and empire. Because the spear story begins long before the Nazis, long before the rise of fascism, and long before the world plunged into war. Its origins lie in the heart of Christian tradition, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. According to the ancient narrative, a Roman centurion named Longinus pierced Jesus' side with a lance to confirm his death. The weapon used in this act became known in Christian law as the Holy Lance, or the Spear of Longinus. Over centuries, the spear transformed from a simple Roman weapon into a relic of immense spiritual significance. It was believed to carry divine power, power that could bless an empire or destroy it. Medieval rulers claimed that whoever possessed the spear held the destiny of the world. From Charlemagne to the Holy Roman emperors, the lance was treated not just as a relic, but as a symbol of unstoppable authority. It was said that so long as the ruler held the spear, his empire would thrive. But once it slipped from his grasp, the empire would fall. This prophecy would echo across centuries and eventually reach the ears of a young, obscure Austrian man walking the streets of Vienna. At the beginning of the 20th century, Vienna was a city of art, culture, philosophy, and mysticism. Its museums housed relics from across Europe. Its coffee houses were filled with dreamers, writers, and radicals. And in the Hofburg Palace treasury lay a case of ancient imperial artifacts. Among them was a spear believed by many to be the very lance of Longinus. This was the Spear of Destiny, a relic carried by Holy Roman emperors, Napoleon, and Habsburg rulers, and it was here that Adolf Hitler first encountered it. As a struggling young artist in Vienna, Hitler visited the Hofburg Museum frequently. He was fascinated by imperial history. He was drawn to symbols of power, and he became captivated by the legend that whoever possessed the spear would determine the fate of the world. Later in life, Hitler himself claimed that he experienced something profound when he stood before the relic, something he could not describe, something that marked him. Whether this was imagination, self-mythology, or genuine belief remains debated by historians. But one fact is clear: Hitler never forgot the spear. The years passed. Europe changed. War came and went. Empires rose and collapsed, and Hitler, driven by ambition and belief, began his ascent to political power. By the 1930s, he was no longer a young artist in a museum. He was the leader of a political movement that sought to rewrite the destiny of Germany. Alongside his rise came the creation of institutions like the Ahnenerbe, a Nazi research organization dedicated to studying the origins, myths, and symbols of ancient civilizations. The Nazis were drawn not only to political conquest, but to spiritual and historical relics they believed held power. From the Holy Grail to Aryan mythology to Tibetan legends, they searched for artifacts that could legitimize their ideology and fuel their propaganda. And at the center of this ideological obsession stood the Spear of Destiny. For Hitler, Vienna was more than a city he once called home. It was the birthplace of his worldview, his beliefs, and his mythology. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Hitler returned to Vienna not merely as a conqueror, but as a man reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. Among the first objectives after the Anschluss was the seizure of Austria's imperial treasures. And inside the Hofburg Palace, in its gold ornate treasury, lay the spear, the relic that had fascinated him as a young man, the relic he believed held the fate of empires, the relic he would now take to Germany. The spear of destiny was transported to Nuremberg, the symbolic heart of the Nazi movement, a city chosen for rallies, ceremonies, and ideological showmanship. Here, the spear became more than a relic. It became a symbol of Nazi power, a link between Hitler and the mythic empires he wished to emulate. And the legend of the spear, its prophecy of victory and downfall, merged with the ambitions of the Third Reich. But the story of the Spear of Destiny does not end with its capture. Its true mystery unfolds during the final days of the war, when Nazi Germany collapsed and Allied forces advanced on Nuremberg. Because when the United States took the city, they captured the relic, and within hours of its seizure, Adolf Hitler was dead. For believers in the prophecy, this was not coincidence. For historians, it was symbolic timing. For it remains one of the most dramatic alignments between myth and reality in modern history. But to understand what the spear meant to the Nazis, we must go deeper, into the origins of the Ahnenerbe, into the occult beliefs that shaped Nazi ideology, and into the wartime missions undertaken to secure ancient artifacts. Because the Spear of Destiny was only one part of a far larger and stranger obsession. To understand why Hitler believed so intensely in symbols like the Spear of Destiny, we must step inside the strange, layered world of Nazi ideology, a world where history, myth, and political ambition blurred into something far more dangerous. This was not simply a political movement. It was a belief system, a worldview built on racial myth, pseudoscience, and a carefully constructed vision of ancient power. And at the center of this worldview stood the idea that certain relics, artifacts, and symbols held the destiny of nations. Hitler was not a religious man in the traditional sense, but he was deeply influenced by mystical and romantic ideas about history. From his early years in Vienna, he absorbed a mix of German nationalism, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and occult-influenced writings that circulated in the city's cultural underworld. Vienna at the time was filled with fringe groups that blended mythology with pseudoscience, Germanic rune societies, occult fraternities, and racial theory clubs. These groups promoted the idea that ancient Germanic peoples were part of a superior race with hidden origins and forgotten powers. Among them were the Thule Society, the Guido von List Society, and others with intense interest in runes, rituals, and ancient legends. Hitler did not necessarily join these movements, but he absorbed their ideas, shaping them into his own ideology. This ideological environment laid the groundwork for the creation of the Ahnenerbe, one of the most secretive and bizarre organizations of the entire Nazi regime. Founded in 1935 by Heinrich Himmler, the Ahnenerbe was dedicated to researching the archaeological and cultural history of the Aryan race. Officially, its mission was scientific. In reality, it merged pseudo-archaeology, folklore, racial mythology, and political propaganda. It employed anthropologists, archaeologists, linguists, explorers, and occult enthusiasts. Their goal was to find evidence that supported Nazi racial ideology and to uncover relics that might serve as symbols for the regime. The Ahnenerbe conducted expeditions across Europe and beyond, searching for ancient Germanic sites, runes, ritual objects, and artifacts tied to Indo-European myth. Some missions were political, some were scientific. Some bordered on the fantastical. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was one of the Ahnenerbe's most devoted believers. He saw himself as a guardian of ancient German heritage and reimagined the SS as a kind of modern, knightly order. He filled SS ceremonies with runic symbols, pagan references, and medieval imagery. He redesigned Wewelsburg Castle as a spiritual headquarters, a place intended to become the epicenter of a mythical new Germanic empire. The castle's north tower featured a circular chamber with a 12-spoked sun symbol in the floor, a design often associated with occult interpretation. This environment reveals a crucial truth. The Nazi leadership was not merely political. They were ideologically obsessed with the idea that symbols and relics carried real power. Hitler's interest was more focused than Himmler's. He was drawn not to ritual or occult practice, but to symbols of empire. He believed that powerful relics, especially those associated with past empires, held psychological and historical significance. The Spear of Destiny was one such symbol. It represented imperial authority stretching back to Rome and the Holy Roman Empire. Hitler saw the spear not as a magical tool, but as a symbol of legitimacy, a link between himself and the rulers of Europe's greatest empires. To him, holding the spear was like inheriting the mantle of those who once shaped the world. Within the Ahnenerbe, some researchers took the spear's legend literally. They studied medieval texts, Christian relic histories, and the claims surrounding Charlemagne, Otto the Great, and the Habsburg emperors. Others explored older traditions about sacred weapons, seeking a connection between Germanic mythology and Christian relics. What emerged was a hybrid belief system mixing history, folklore, nationalism, and a modern political agenda. This ideological mix gave the Nazi Party a sense of historical destiny, as if they were part of a larger ancient mission. And artifacts like the Spear of Destiny served as anchors for this worldview. When Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, his obsession with reclaiming German imperial heritage became visible in real actions. Vienna's imperial treasury was seized not only for its material value, but for its symbolic power. The Spear of Destiny, which Hitler had seen decades earlier as a young man, was transported to Germany under close SS guard. It was placed in Nuremberg, the ideological capital of the Nazi movement, a city saturated with rallies, rituals, and symbols of the Third Reich. For Nazi propaganda, the relocation of the spear was symbolic proof that Germany had reclaimed the spiritual authority of the old empire. For Hitler, it was the fulfillment of a personal and ideological journey that began in Vienna's museums. But the spear's role in Nazi ideology was only one piece of a larger story. The Ahnenerbe and SS divisions continued searching for relics that matched their worldview. From the Holy Grail to the Ark of the Covenant to ancient Germanic artifacts hidden in caves and castles. Some missions produced archaeological findings. Others were misinterpretations or invented narratives. A few remained shrouded in secrecy. understanding the ideological context is essential for understanding the spear's role in the war. Because as the conflict escalated, the symbolism surrounding the Spear of Destiny became intertwined with real events, real movements of the artifact, and real wartime decisions that determined its final fate during the Anschluss. Hitler's return to Vienna was framed as a moment of triumph. Crowds filled the streets, flags hung from buildings. The former imperial capital became a symbol of Hitler's expanding control. And among the first actions taken by the Nazi administration was the seizure of the imperial treasury. German officials removed the crown, the scepter, the orb, and the Spear of Destiny, and prepared them for transport. The relics were moved with precision and ceremony. Overseen by SS officers, the spear was placed in a specially designed case and shipped to Nuremberg. This city had been chosen as the spiritual center of the Nazi Party, a symbolic home for rallies, parades, and ideological presentations. By relocating the spear to Nuremberg, the Nazis were making a statement. They were inheriting the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire. Symbolism mattered deeply to the regime. They used architecture, relics, flags, and ceremonies to create an image of continuity with ancient power. The Spear of Destiny was a perfect tool for this propaganda. But the spear's journey did not end in Nuremberg. As the tides of war shifted and the Allies advanced across Germany, the Nazi regime began to collapse. In the final months of the war, Nuremberg became a battleground. Its famous rally grounds were bombed, its buildings shattered, and its treasures hidden or destroyed. The Spear of Destiny, the relic that had traveled through centuries of history and been seized by multiple empires, would face yet another dramatic chapter when the city fell into American hands. But what exactly happened in those final days? How did the spear survive the destruction? Who found it? Where was it taken? And why did Hitler die within hours of its capture? History provides documented answers, but the legend adds layers of mystery. As World War II entered its final desperate months, Nazi Germany was collapsing on every front. Cities lay in ruins. Supply lines had disintegrated. Entire divisions surrendered or vanished. And in this chaos, the fate of one of the world's most mysterious relics hung in the balance. The Spear of Destiny. The relic had been moved from Vienna to Nuremberg shortly after the Anschluss. For years, it remained inside the city's historic castle, alongside the imperial regalia. It was kept in a secure underground vault, protected by SS guards and surrounded by thick medieval stone walls. But by 1945, even Nuremberg itself could no longer protect the treasures within it. Nuremberg was symbolic for the Nazi regime. It held the massive party rallies. It housed the ceremonial heart of the Third Reich. It was a city Hitler believed connected his movement to the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire. For this reason, the city had been a prime target for Allied bombing. By late 1944, most of Nuremberg was a landscape of shattered buildings, burned streets, and collapsed fortifications. The Allies knew that if Germany had hidden anything important, documents, artwork, relics, Nuremberg would be one of the places to look. During the final months of the war, the relics were quietly relocated within the city to avoid destruction. They were placed in a deep shelter beneath the historic castle, in a vault that had been reinforced to withstand the heaviest bombs. Inside this underground chamber were the crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire, centuries-old royal ornaments, and the Spear of Destiny itself. The Nazi regime did not intend for these relics to fall into Allied hands. But by 1945, they no longer controlled the speed of events around them. In April 1945, American forces pushed deep into southern Germany, capturing city after city as the Third Reich disintegrated. Nuremberg became one of the key strategic targets, not only for its symbolic value, but for the fear that the Nazis might destroy or hide what remained of their cultural and historical treasures. On April 20th, American troops entered Nuremberg after heavy fighting and bombardment. What they found was a devastated city still smoldering from recent battles. But among the ruins stood the imperial castle, damaged but intact enough that the vault below it could still be accessed. It was in this vault that the Spear of Destiny was discovered by American soldiers working under the U.S. Army's Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, the same group later known as the Monuments Men. Captain Walter Horn, a German-born American intelligence officer and medieval art historian, played a major role in confirming the authenticity of the relics found. Inside the vault, beneath layers of protective material, lay the case containing the Holy Lance. It was removed, examined, and secured by U.S. forces, along with the rest of the imperial regalia. The spear had survived the collapse of the city, the bombings, and the chaotic retreat of German forces. Shortly after the capture of the spear, an event occurred that later fueled one of the most enduring legends surrounding the relic. On April 30th, 1945, just days after Nuremberg fell and the spear came into American possession, Adolf Hitler died in his bunker in Berlin. To historians, Hitler's death was the result of Germany's inevitable defeat and his refusal to face surrender. But to those who believed in the spear's prophecy, the timing was too precise to ignore. For centuries, the legend had said that whoever held the spear held the fate of the world, and that when the spear passed from one ruler to another, so too would their power collapse. Hitler's death, occurring within hours of the spear's capture, was taken by many as the final fulfillment of this prophecy. The relic was transported to Nuremberg's Palace of Justice and later to a secure location in Bamberg. American authorities studied it and confirmed its identity as the same spear preserved in Vienna's treasury before the war. After the conflict ended and Austria regained independence, the United States returned the spear to Vienna in 1946. It was placed back into the Hofburg Palace, where it remains today as part of the imperial treasury. Visitors can still view it, a relic surrounded by both religious devotion and speculative legend. But the spear's return to Vienna did not end the questions about its deeper meaning or its connection to Hitler's beliefs, because behind the myth lies a much larger story about how the Nazis sought to reshape history, reinterpret mythology, and use ancient relics to justify their ambitions. The final chapter of this story involves the aftermath of the war, the survival of the spear's legend, and the decades-long debates about myth, symbolism, and the human desire to find meaning even in the darkest moments of history. When the war ended and the world confronted the ruins left behind, the Spear of Destiny emerged once again into public view. It had survived the destruction of Nuremberg, the fall of the Third Reich, and the collapse of Hitler's empire. But the relic did not return to obscurity. Instead, it became the center of a historical debate that continues even today, a debate about myth, symbolism, and the human need to connect meaning to power. Once the spear was securely stored by American forces, a team of experts documented every detail. The spearhead, the gold and silver clamps on its surface, and the added iron rod belonged to a well-known medieval relic long housed in Vienna's imperial treasury. There was no doubt that the artifact found in Nuremberg was the same one removed from the Hofburg in 1938. After this confirmation, the spear was transported back to Austria. In January 1946, the US military returned the entire set of regalia to the Austrian government. The spear was restored to the Hofburg Palace, its home for centuries. There it remains, displayed behind protective glass, as one of Europe's most important historical relics. With the relic returned, scholars began examining the historical claims surrounding the spear. Some historians emphasized that the spear likely dated to the early medieval period rather than the time of the Roman Empire. Others pointed out that relics across Europe were often given legendary associations to strengthen their spiritual and political influence. Still, the symbolism of the spear did not disappear with academic analysis. Instead, new interpretations emerged as writers, theologians, psychologists, and researchers attempted to understand why so many leaders through history believed the relic held power. The idea that the spear shaped destiny was not a Nazi invention. It came from medieval prophecies and legends that had circulated for centuries. These stories claimed that the spear had passed from one imperial ruler to another, a chain of power stretching from Charlemagne to the Habsburgs. And the legend warned that if the spear ever left the hands of its rightful ruler, their empire would fall. This prophecy seemed to align with the collapse of empires throughout history. Each time the relic changed possession, a ruler died, an empire fractured, or a dynasty ended. These patterns fascinated those who believed in the spear's supernatural influence. After the war, the legend found new life through writers and researchers who explored the intersection of myth and history. Trevor Ravenscroft's later book, The Spear of Destiny, popularized the idea that Hitler's fascination with the spear was central to his worldview. While historians debate the accuracy of Ravenscroft's interpretations, his work sealed the spear's place in popular imagination. It became a symbol not only of ancient power, but of the dangerous path that can emerge when myth and ideology intertwine. The historical truth is both simpler and more complex. Hitler's obsession with the spear reflected his belief in the power of symbols. He understood that relics could strengthen political narratives, inspire followers, and connect modern movements to ancient traditions. The Nazis used the spear not as a magical instrument, but as a tool of propaganda, a symbol to convince the world and themselves that their movement represented a continuation of imperial destiny. Yet the timing of Hitler's death, relative to the spear's capture, ensured that the legend would never disappear from public conversation. To this day, visitors stand before the glass case in the Hofburg Palace and confront a relic woven into both history and myth. The spear itself is silent, a piece of metal shaped by ancient hands. Its stories, however, are anything but silent. They include centuries of warfare, religious devotion, political manipulation, misinterpretation, and fascination. The relic represents how humans search for meaning in the rise and fall of nations, how symbols guide empires, how belief systems influence rulers, and how myth can shape decisions that alter the course of history. In the end, the spear of destiny is not powerful because of what it is. It is powerful because of what people believed it to be. The spear did not control the fate of Hitler or his empire. His downfall came from political miscalculation, military failure, and the consequences of a destructive ideology. But the legend of the spear reflects the deeper truth that myths hold extraordinary influence over the human mind. The Nazis did not conquer Europe with relics. They conquered it with belief. And belief can be more powerful, more dangerous, and more enduring than any physical weapon. The story of the Spear of Destiny is ultimately a story about the intersection of history, myth, and ambition. It reveals how relics can shape identities, how symbols can guide empires, and how the past can be reshaped to justify the present. And it shows that even in the modern world, ancient legends continue to echo through the decisions of those who seek power. This has been the Unknown Zone, where ancient relics cross paths with modern history, and where myths, long buried, still cast shadows across the world we know. The Spear of Destiny stood in the hands of emperors, rested in medieval treasuries, inspired mystics and rulers, and became entangled in the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Its story is not about magic, but about meaning. The meaning people attach to symbols they believe can shape their world. And in this search for meaning, power rises, power collapses, and history continues its unbroken march. This is the Unknown Zone, where the legends of the past meet the truth that time cannot hide.